This is our fourth webinar for the USA Prosper Africa AGOA eligibility program that we're running. Today's webinar is focusing on costing and quoting for exports and is very focused on the medical device industry. Our last webinar was focused on cosmetics. So this time around, we're looking at medical devices, which are exported over to the US at the moment in quite a large number, but we're hoping to obviously grow that as we educate people on the opportunity in that space. Just for people to join in other languages, obviously you can't, if you can't understand what I'm saying or a little bit, these are the instructions to get subtitles and translation onto your system. So please go through this. And that allows you to get into multiple languages. We've got French, Portuguese, and various other languages on there which you can join, but mainly for French and Portuguese speakers this session. Great. So today's program, there will be 4 speakers. Myself as the moderator and just presenting on the program that we're running. I am Rex Bowden from Catalyze. We'll then have Mike Smith from ITRISA, which is the International Trade Institute of Southern Africa, who'll be presenting on costing and quoting for exports. Then we'll have Graham Blackbeard come on board from Southern Implant. He'll give us information about his experience in exporting to the US and working in the US market. And then we will finish off with Simone Rudolph Short from MDMSA, who is a consultant for the medical device industry. And she'll give us some insight in programs that she's been involved in and how to get yourself ready before you even get into those USA markets and getting your products certified and registered and all the right boxes ticked for that. Just as mentioned, this is a webinar for the Prosper Africa AGOA eligibility and trade logistics program that we're running. It's a customer support service program where we supply support services for people to give them information on getting their products into market as simply as possible. Just to round that up as well, it's based on 4 parts, I say. One is customer support services, which is basically chatting to you, getting you to fill out a form, understanding what your company needs assistance with. We are doing a huge amount of association training sessions. We're doing 4, but we've just expanded that to 6 now, and I'll run through those quickly with you. There's a lot of AGOA PR and marketing that goes into this as well. So we're pushing that use of AGOA, and there's a lot of marketing that goes behind the utilization of these services. And we'll run through all over other programs with Catalyze is running with USAID at the moment and various other associations to give African exporters access into various markets around the world. As mentioned, our customer support services, very simple service that we're running. We keep it easy. We'll be in contact with you to fill out a form. That's the form that you go through. It's a simple Google form that you fill in. Just allows us to get real good information about your company and really understand what you're about and what you're looking for. Our team then goes through an assessment of that information, and anything that we're not sure of, we get back to you and we get you to fill that in or clarify what the situation is. And then from that point onwards, we manage your request, and if there's a need to speak to an expert or for that information to be clarified further by someone other than our team, we will do that, and we support you in those services. We've got 2 really great experts on 2 sides of the program. One is logistics, which is handled by Ruan King from King Cargo. Ruan is able to give you really great insight into what kind of documents you need, certain certificates that he'll need if he exported your products into markets. And then answer some other difficult questions, how to reduce the price of getting your products into markets, how to find ways and the right people to work with in markets to make sure your products get into those markets in the right way. So that's a real great support that Ruan supplies. Ruan is getting products into market every single day. He does a lot of exports of exhibition freight for our company as well. So we get a lot of products, and that's multiple different products at the same time into markets, which is always a struggle. Co-loading is always quite difficult with needing lots of documents in place. So he's the expert on that. And then very fortunate to have Eckhard Naumann from Trelec. Trelec have written the book on AGOA. They run a website called agoa.info that we refer a lot of people to, with loads of different links on how to assess the eligibility of your product, how to find out if your product is accepted into the US and under what terms. It also gives you HS codes for your product. So a really great place to go to if you're unsure if your product will be let into the US and accepted over there. So and then Eckhard comes in with years and years of experience of working with AGOA, and certain nuances that are a little bit more difficult to find out about through the website. He is able to give us detail. I know he's actually assisted with one of the speakers today, with Graham from Southern Implant, and finding some information out for Graham. But he's helped with loads of others. So there's always are certain things that you feel might hinder you in getting your product into the market. Eckhard can give us some great insight into that. And then just to give you sort of an outline on these webinars that we've been running, they really are focused. The idea was to focus them at associations across Africa to help them get their exporters into market, but they've kind of evolved, and we've had a lot of requests from exporters saying we want to be involved in these, and we want to be either speaking on them, or we want to listen and hear how this can help us and educate us on getting our products into market. So we, as mentioned, we were going to only run 4, but the demand has been really high to expand that, and there's so much to say in this space. So we have expanded that to 6. We've already completed 3, and today is our 4th. We are also making it really simple to find out what happened in those webinars. So each time we run about a 2.5 to 3 hour session, we are editing all of these down into 3 minutes. So you can get a quick snapshot of what's happened, and that allow you to then go back to that longer link and watch certain parts which are of key interest to you. So you'll see some of those up on our LinkedIn page already. Those shorter links, but we are making the actual longer webinar recording available straight after the sessions. Our first one was on logistics planning and requirements, so that was key. Making sure you have all the information on what documents you need to have for freight companies to support you. That happened on the 4th of May, and it was quite detailed with a lot of information on there as well about AGOA and the whole information about the actors itself. So have a look on that. Eckhard Naumann also goes into a lot of detail on what happened, what is happening currently with AGOA, the risks and benefits of it as well. So please look into that. And then Ruan gave us really deep insight into the various documents and how you need to fill them in, and how important it is to get those right, so that you protect yourselves when you're getting product into market and don't suffer from demurrage charges and things like that. We then looked at different product classifications and regulations and certification. Quite a lot of information on there about FDA and the requirements to get your product FDA approved. and certified. So please have a look into that. It gives you quite a good information from Registrar Corp, who spoke in depth about that. We then went into our third one with the industry requirements, and that we focused quite heavily on cosmetics over that session. So if you are into cosmetics as well as medical devices, please have a look at that. It gives you some real good information on experience in getting cosmetic products into the market, and certain things you have to have ready to get your products into the US. Today, obviously, is the costing and quotings for exports, so we will go ahead with that. But we have two others that have been added. So various AGOA solutions and in-market support. So we've got great speakers from the US based out there that'll tell us about how to get your product registered and what certain buyers are looking for on your products. So certain other registrations they're looking for your products, and how they can support you into the market. And then we will also do another FDA registration program in our 6th webinar in October. And then give some more market insights. So we'll have a couple of other exporters and buyers that will speak about how things are going. From my experience lately, being out in New York a few weeks ago for a food event, great interest in dealing with Africa, a bit of a change in the guard of accepting products from other parts of the world at the moment. It seems Americans are opening up their minds to where they get things. So quite exciting for the African market at the moment. Just to give you a bit of outline of what's happening with the marketing, we've got an animated video that comes out and sort of gives you advice on how to use our customer support and how to use agoa.info and really source more great information on getting your products into market. So that'll be coming out in the next week or so, just going through hundreds of approvals with USAID and Prosper Africa at the moment, but should be ready to go quite soon. As mentioned, all of our webinars are edited, so have a look out for those down into 3 minutes. And then, a lot of PR going out at the moment, making sure people understand that AGOA is available to you. It is a reduction in tariffs and customs, so have a look at that information as well. And we're really trying to drive that at the moment to make sure people are utilizing it as much as possible. And then just a little bit about Catalyze. We are obviously, we push a lot of international pavilions. As mentioned, we were out at Summer Fancy Food a few weeks ago. That was a great participation. There was about 30 African companies at that event, but there's a lot more to come. We do quite a lot with the medical device industry as well. So we've got a group going to Africa Health this year in Johannesburg, and another group going to Arab Health in Dubai next year with the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition from South Africa. So that's a great program, but obviously open to other African companies to go out to those shows on their own. We also run various hosted buyer programs. So we do stuff with the various events and help them bring hosted buyers in. We're doing one at the moment, so for Professional Beauty Johannesburg, where we are hosting 10 buyers from around Africa. So if you also are hosted, or you are a buyer of cosmetic products or pharmaceuticals, medical devices, please get in contact with us. There's great, we managed to get funding from government for this. So we get a stipend for your travel for about $400 for your flights or however else you get down into the country, and then pay for hotel accommodation while you're out. So please keep an eye out and reach out to us on that. You'll also see that on our LinkedIn posts as well, but really looking for some great buyers to bring down for Professional Beauty, and we'll put you into meeting programs. You'll meet with all the various exhibitors at that show and start engaging with them to maybe represent them in your markets around Africa. So please be in touch with us with that. Our B2B matchmaking programs as well. We run those virtually and as well as in person. So we do this for various embassies and and various trade associations, where we put together targeted meetings for you with the right buyers in certain markets. We'd love to do that for more people as well. Great direct to buyer, where buyer and seller both know each other and start engaging with each other on a understanding from the beginning of each other's products, because they understand who they're meeting before they meet. So it's great. Very turnaround very quick on that. We see sort of between 2 to 6 months turnaround on sales, just because they're much more targeted, much more information driven meetings. So you're meeting with someone that you have full insight into to start with. So really exciting on both those fronts. We run some of our own industry events, as mentioned, in point 3 there, Africa Games Week and Ocean Innovation Africa, 2 of the leading events of their kind. Africa Games Week's for the video games industry, and it's the largest gathering of video game professionals African video game professionals in the world. Last count in 2022 December were 250 that were involved. So that's a great event. Huge amounts of investment and publishing deals coming through that in the region of about $300 million. So, and that's growing each year. Such a great industry from that. And then we run Ocean Innovation Africa, which is the leading ocean economy event in Africa. Again, about 500 delegates come through to that event. Very high level. Indian Ocean Commission gets involved, World Oceans Council, EU Commission on Sustainability, and various others get involved in that event, really protecting the ocean, finding sustainable, innovative ways to work in the ocean space. And then we run an event called Engage Trade Africa. So that is a leading event for promoting African manufactured products to the US and from Africa into South Africa as well. So we bring in US buyers from various parts of America to get involved in that, to source products from Africa, as well as South African buyers to look at sourcing from Africa. What we found over the last few years is buyers come from all different industries. You don't need to necessarily just be from retail. You can be from a manufacturer, a distributor. You can obviously be from different wholesalers and retailers, but the market is very wide. And we are bringing in all kinds of African manufacturers doing ingredients to that show, both in food and cosmetics. There's a huge opportunity in that. And the real drive that we see in Engage Trade Africa is that a lot of product is lost from Africa to Asia. So a lot of raw materials are leaving the continent, where we really should be keeping them in the continent and producing them in the continent. I mean, we see everything from really high precious metals to grains and different cosmetic ingredients that are leaving the continent all the time, only to be sold back as finished products to Africa. So really trying to drive that between certain countries like South Africa, buying ingredients from and raw materials from across Africa and value adding those and getting them into other markets around the world, like the US. But yeah, a lot of interest came out of the last few editions. Engage Trade Africa ran virtually in 21 and 22, and we ran in live and in person in March 2023. And brought out some amazing buyers. Some huge opportunities came from that. It's amazing the opportunities that are available when you bring people together. Sometimes they're happening cross-border, between Limpopo and Mozambique. There's opportunities between that and trucks going out to Mozambique and coming back empty when they should be coming back with cashew nuts, for example. So huge opportunity in that space. And we will looking to drive that event in 2024 as well. Great. So a little bit early. So Mike has thought a little bit earlier than expected. Mike will be joining us shortly, but I'll just do a little introduction for him before he comes online. So Mike is from a company called ITRISA. ITRISA are the International Trade Institute of Southern Africa. They do a huge amount of training across the continent, teaching people on how to export their products around the world and what they have to have in order to get their products into those markets. And we were approached by one of Mike's colleagues saying, you know, what we find is a huge issue is people manufacture products and then push their products into market, but they actually often miss a crucial step, and that is costing and getting the prices right for exports, so that they're either not too low in the market. You know, you get your prices wrong and push your prices to market at too low, and people think there's inferior quality, or you push your prices into a market too high and people disregard you on that because it's just sounds like a crazy idea, and from the get-go you are on the back foot trying to find yourself in a market where, if you had done a little bit of research and work with someone like ITRISA to get your costing and quoting correct, you would have started on a much better grounding. So it's great to have Mike with us. Mike is the director and consultant and senior trainer at ITRISA. He's based out in Durban in South Africa. He has been involved in international trade for more than 40 years. After a number of years as a shipping manager for a manufacturing concern, he joined the then South African trade organization, SAFTO, in the early 1980s as an export consultant. Shortly afterwards, he was promoted to manager of the Export Efficiency Unit and then to senior manager, International Trade Affairs, before relocating to Durban as SAFTO's regional manager, KwaZulu-Natal. He became a director of ITRISA in 2012. And that's about the time when I got back to South Africa. So it's exciting to hear what Mike has to say for us. Mike, can you join us on camera? Thanks, Mike.
Hope I'm there.
Great. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for joining us today. Can you, maybe start? Are you going to start by sharing your slides, or are you going to start with a little presentation first and then move into that?
Yes, I'll just have a few words first.
Okay, brilliant. And just so everybody knows, please put questions on the chat. We'll be writing stuff on the chat as well, encouraging you. Please don't be shy. We will take all these questions at the end. So we'll let Mike get through his presentation as well as the others. But after each speaker, we will address those questions. So for Mike's presentation, please share it on the chat and we'll take it from there. Thanks, Mike.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Mike. Your slides came up, but then they disappeared again.
Yes. Okay. Good. As my slide said there, I'm just trying to get it back up. Just let me see what I'm doing here. Sorry about this. I'm just not quite sure what I've done here. I've minimized something and I can't seem to maximize it again. So just bear with me.
Okay, that's fine, Mike. So just while Mike's trying to get that back, please note that Cindy will be messaging you directly on Zoom chat, please, just to get your contact details so we know who's joined this session. So please respond back to her. Often we can't, people join and we just see their telephone number or various words against their name. You can also rename yourselves if you want to go and do that. Cindy will be in contact with you to get your details, so we can contact you afterwards as well.
Good. Okay, I think I'm with you again.
You are, but we still can't see your slides, Mike.
Okay, no, I'll bring them up shortly.
Brilliant.
Good. Okay, so we're speaking about costing and quoting for exports. Pricing, of course, is a separate issue. We price our goods according to what the market dictates, but pricing can't be done until we have an accurate idea of what our costs are. So we're going to discuss how an exporter should cost his product, all the factors he should take into account, and then based on that, he can decide what his prices should be. And then we're going to take the next step and look at proper quoting. For our quotes to be effective, there's three things that our quote needs to achieve. Firstly, it needs to be comprehensive. When we submit a quote to a buyer, we should have all bases covered. If they are not comprehensive, the buyer couldn't buy from us even if he wanted to. So we've got to give him all the information. Second thing, our quotes need to be unambiguous. When it comes to international trade quotes, it is very easy to make mistakes that result in a quote having dual meanings. And when there's more than one possible meaning to a quote, the buyer invariably is going to opt for the meaning that suits himself, and that invariably does not suit the seller. So it must be unambiguous. And we're going to give you examples of that. And thirdly, the quote needs to be simple. The simpler, the better. So putting together a good export quote is quite a task. But before we get to quoting, we want to look at the cost aspects. Now, in order to cost, we are looking at the US. The same principles apply all around the world. Doesn't matter where you're going. But if we're looking at the US, the only way we can get our product there is either by road, either by sea or by air. And so we are going to be looking at these aspects of costing by sea and by air. But before we even look at the costing aspect, there's a couple of things that we need to clearly understand we need to understand it, make it our own, make sure that we cost according to these principles. So let's just briefly overview the sea options that we have. The first and the most common option for sea transport is to use the services of the shipping line that provides a basic port-to-port service. As we've indicated on the slide here, when a shipping line offers a port-to-port service, the responsibility of the shipping line to move your cargo is restricted to port to port. In other words, the costs involved for getting the goods to the port on our side in South Africa, and the costs involved in getting the goods moved from the port to the buyer's premises has got nothing to do with the shipping line. The shipping line is purely responsible for the movement of the goods from port to port. Now, if you go for the port-to-port option, and this, by the way, is still the most common option in international trade, to use port-to-port. If you're going port-to-port, then the terms that you're quoting on should be either FOB, which means free on board in Durban or in Cape Town or in Port Elizabeth, wherever you're shipping from. FOB, CFR, or CIF. Now, FOB means simply that the seller is responsible for all the costs to put the goods onto the ship. That's where his costs and risks end. The buyer pays all costs beyond that. If you're going to cost to a CFR basis, FOB plus the cost of the freight brings you to your CFR point. So if the seller has quoted a buyer FOB Durban, for example, the buyer must pay the freight from Durban on, and including the American side of it. But the seller pays all the costs to get the goods onto the ship. If you're quoting CFR New York, let's say, now the seller must pay the freight to New York, but the buyer insures the goods. So although the seller is quoting CFR New York, which means the seller is now paying the freight across the ocean, it's important to note that the risk belongs to the buyer. So the seller's risk ends once he's put the goods onto the ship, even although he's paying the freight to the other side. And the same principle applies if you're selling on a CIF basis, CIF New York. This means that the seller now is paying the freight and taking the insurance to New York, but the risk still ends once the goods have been placed on board the ship in Durban. This is a concept that is essential for exporters and importers to understand. These terms are called departure terms. The implication is that the seller's risk ends at the point of departure. So this is the correct terms to use if you are going port to port. Full container loads are often shipped on a port-to-port basis. Shipping lines do, however, offer an additional service, and that is illustrated over here in multimodal services. Now, to get our cost and our quoting correct, we must understand clearly what multimodal means. Multimodal doesn't simply mean you are using more than one mode of transport. If that was the case, then what we've called port-to-port would also actually be multimodal, because you've used road or rail to get the goods from the seller's premises to the port, then you've used sea transport, then you've used road or rail on the other side. So any sale really is multimodal. Even if you're selling by air, it would be multimodal because you use road to get to the airport. That is not what we mean by multimodal. Okay, so what is meant by multimodal in the modern sense of the word? It's actually been defined by the International Chamber of Commerce, and we've illustrated it here. The ICC defines multimodal as more than one mode of transport under a single contract. And when you do that, then your terms must change. And I repeat that, more than one mode of transport under a single contract. And so we've illustrated a few options here. Obviously, if one enters into a contract with a carrier or a shipping line, and that shipping line gives you a warehouse to warehouse freight rate, obviously the shipping line itself is only moving the goods port to port, but the shipping line now has undertaken the responsibility of moving the goods warehouse to warehouse, which means that bill of lading is no longer only going to be port to port, it's going to be warehouse to warehouse. So for example, a bill of lading that says place of loading Johannesburg, port of loading Durban, port of discharge New York, final destination Pittsburgh, USA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is no longer a port-to-port service. It's gone beyond that. It is a multimodal service. So that's multimodal on both sides of the ocean journey. It does not have to encompass the whole journey. This would also be multimodal, where the shipping line takes the goods from the port in Durban, and as I've indicated here, moves the goods to the buyer's premises or to an inland container terminal. That would also be multimodal, because that bill of lading is covering more than one mode of transport. This would also be multimodal if the shipping line takes charge of the goods at the seller's premises and moves them now just to the foreign port. All these are options under multimodal contracts. Now, when you start using multimodal services, which by the way is much more convenient for buyer and the seller, it simplifies the whole thing, then you cannot use these port-to-port terms. This FOB, CFR, and CIF are only for port-to-port shipments. Now you've got to use these terms FCA, CPT, or CIP. And they basically run parallel to FOB, CFR, CIF, but are designed specifically for multimodal services. So the FCA point is equivalent to the FOB. Instead of being at a port, as FOB must be at a port, FCA can be from the seller's premises. And the CPT and the CIP, instead of the CIF story being at a port, can extend, the CPT and the CIP can extend to the buyer's premises. So you'll notice, of course, how this simplifies the seller's costing. Because if he's quoting FCA, his premises, he doesn't have any real costs in moving the cargo to get to his premises. That's where the goods are. And then he adds a single freight rate, and that ends up at the buyer's premises. The shipping line has incorporated all these things into a single contract. So that's the first thing the seller must decide, is what are the correct terms to use, because that's going to directly affect the way you cost. Just on that, before we leave this, one more aspect. I've spoken about this really in the context of full container loads. Full container loads can be shipped port to port, or they can be shipped on a multimodal basis. If one does not have enough cargo for a full container and you're opting for less than container loads or groupage transport, this is where excuse me, a container is shared by more than one exporter. Very common. So what happens now is the shipping line arranges for the cargo to be consolidated. So a number of exporters will take their cargo to a depot, a container depot. They will consolidate on behalf of the shipping line. The shipping line will then move the container to a foreign depot, from whence the buyer will collect his cargo. So this entire movement of the cargo from depot to depot is the responsibility of the carrier. And because moving the cargo from depot to depot under a single contract, we've indicated here, bill of lading from depot to depot, you've got road or rail, sea, and then road or rail on the other side. this is automatically a multimodal shipment. So your port-to-port terms would not be correct to use here. So we've indicated the terms to use here again are FCA and CPT or CIP. I just wanted to clarify those things first before we actually start speaking about costing. Port-to-port shipments are still the dominant ones. And so we will use that as a basis for our discussion. Can I just mention one other thing? If you're going to go air freight, obviously you cannot use these terms because these terms are exclusively when we are speaking Incoterms here. When the Incoterms use the word port, they mean seaport. So FOB, CFR, CIF are exclusively for sea transport. So even if you're going airport to airport, you cannot use these terms. So sea transport, these three terms are exclusively for port-to-port services. And sea transport, when you're doing multimodal, then you must use these alternate terms. If you're going by air, you cannot use FOB, CFR, CIF. You have to use these terms, FCA, CPT, or CIP. So airport to airport, for example, would be FCA, CPT, and CIP. That's just a brief overview of the correct terms to use. Using the incorrect Incoterms puts your whole contract on the wrong foot. And it may work. It may work for a while until something goes wrong, and then there's a problem. Okay, so having established the terms that we're going to use, the next thing for the seller to do is to cost up to whatever term he is going to use. So if you've opted to sell in a full container load and you're going to stick to the traditional port-to-port, the seller would have to move the cargo to the port, whichever South African port that is. So the road and rail costs of getting the goods there are for the seller's account. The next thing the seller would have to do is pay the port charges. And there are two port charges. They are called cargo dues and THC, standing for terminal handling costs. Those would have to be paid by the seller. This contracts the seller to lift the goods and place them onto the ship. The seller would, because he is carrying the risk of damage or loss to that cargo up until they are placed onto the ship, the seller would likely also insure the goods up to that point. He would not insure the goods beyond that point because that becomes the risk of the buyer. The buyer will insure the goods beyond that point. So those are the costs that we want to look at. In addition, the seller would have to clear these goods through customs out of South Africa. You cannot put anything into a port unless it's being customs cleared, and the term requires the seller to customs clear out of South Africa. That's where his delivery costs, as defined by the Incoterm, would end. If he wanted to quote CFR New York, for example, he would simply take those costs and add the cost of transport to New York. Then he has a CFR New York price. So he adds the sea freight. And then if he's going to quote CIF New York, he adds the cost of insuring the goods all the way to New York. So that's what we want to aim for right now. So with that in mind, then, let's have a look at a costing sheet. I'll just get it here. I'm going to make this full screen. So here we've listed the standard costs that an exporter should take into account, whether he's to get from Ex Works to either FOB or FCA. Those two terms are parallel terms, remember, depending on whether it's port to port or multimodal. And then to CFR or CPT, those two terms are parallel. And then to CIF or CIP, those two terms are parallel. So before I discuss these points any further, can I just make or divide these costs into a few basic categories? And it doesn't matter what cost you come across going to anywhere in the world, they will fall into one of these categories. Okay, the first is what is called specific costs. Specific costs are those costs which you can actually quite easily calculate. A specific cost would be a cost per container if you're going full container loads. It could be a cost per ton. So you would know how many tons you've got, and so you can calculate the specific cost. So these costs listed at the top here are all specific costs. Cost per container or per ton. The second category of costs are ad valorem costs. And these costs are percentages, ad valorem, from Latin, added to value. So they are based on the value of the goods. So we have ad valorem costs. And then we have costs per shipment. So some of these specific costs could be a cost per ton or per container. Others are a cost per shipment, and we need to separate those things. So let's speak about the specific costs. We're just listing these as an example here, but they do often come up. So for example, if you're sitting in Johannesburg and you've decided to road haul the goods to the port, the road haulier will give you, let's assume it's a full container. The road haulier will give you a cost to move a full container to the port. On the other hand, you could decide to rail the goods to the port. If you're going to rail the goods to the port, you need to haul the goods to the container depot in Johannesburg and then rail it to the port. But both of them, either way, is a specific cost. It's a cost per container. So that's easy to deal with. Terminal handling charge is that port charge I referred to. That's also a cost per container, as is cargo dues. These are costs per container. So they are easy to deal with. Liner service fee is a cost per container as well. Then these costs here are costs. These two costs are costs incurred by the clearing and forwarding agent. The forwarding agent may charge you a handling fee. That is a cost per shipment, not per container. So if you have 2 containers, you're going to have to double up on your port charges, but this is not a cost for per container, so that's not doubled up, as is the forwarder's documentation fee. Speaking about forwarders, you see this overflows into these ad valorem charges. So depending on what you negotiate with your clearing and forwarding agent, he could charge you a flat fee. That's what we've called a handling fee here. he always charges you a documentation fee. That is also a specific cost for a set of documents, depending on what documents he's doing for you. But many clearing agents, instead of charging a handling fee, charge what they call an agency fee and a disbursement fee. So I just want to briefly explain what these two are. The agency fee is the cost for his service, as instead of a flat fee. But it's an ad valorem. So he may say his agency fee is 3% of his disbursements. And just park that for a moment. 3% of disbursements. Then in addition, he charges you a disbursement fee. So he may say the disbursement fee is 2%. So what's the difference between the agency and the disbursement? The agency, as I've said, is a cost for his service. The disbursement fee is a finance charge because he's paying out money for and on behalf of the exporter. He's paying out, for example, normally he pays those harbor charges, he pays the freight, then he invoices the exporter, and the exporter pays him in 30 days, whatever they've agreed. So he says, actually, the exporter has been sitting on his money for a period of time, and so he charges a disbursement fee. Excuse me. So if you, for example, were to charge a 3% agency and 2% disbursement, that's a total of 5%. And then on this costing sheet, which is just a sample, says based on. So that 5% would be based on the disbursements, the money that he has paid out. And so the seller would have to decide, okay, what are the disbursements? What is the money that the clearing agent is going to pay out? And add all those costs together and take that 5% as a percentage in order to calculate the disbursement fee. These next charges are not related to the movement of the cargo. So they are not Incoterm driven. Incoterms are terms of delivery. So the Incoterms say, under FOB, the seller must pay all these charges. If you have any cost that is not Incoterm related, in other words, it's not related to the physical delivery of the goods, all those costs must be taken into account before you quote your first Incoterm. So we've put things like finance charges, credit insurance premiums, agents' commissions, or whatever else you have. The agent here, by the way, is a sales agent, not a clearing and forwarding agent. If you have any other ad valorem charges, you need to put it before your FOB or your FCA. The reason for this is simple. Once you've hit FOB, the only cost you can add is the cost of the freight to get to the CFR price. Now the freight is a specific cost. It's very easy to calculate. The shipping lines gives you the rate per container. You've got 2 containers, you can calculate that. When it comes to insurance, however, that's not so easy, because the insurance premium, again, is an ad valorem thing. It's a percentage based on a particular value. So obviously, for all these percentages, we need to know what value to base them on in order to accurately cost. And the CIF is a bit more complex because the rules under CIF and CIP say that the value that the seller insures must be the full CIF or CIP value plus 10%. So if your full CIF value came to 100,000 Rand or dollars, whatever, you would have to insure 110,000 Rands or dollars. So that's a brief overview of the cost. Now, as you go about your business, You may come up with costs that we haven't listed here. It doesn't matter. You simply say to yourself, okay, is it a specific cost or an ad valorem cost? If it's a specific cost, is it a cost per ton, per container, or whatever? Or is it a cost per shipment? If it's an ad valorem cost, on what is it based? The only costs based on disbursement are those from your freight forwarder. Other costs are either going to be based on the FOB, the CIF, or even CIF plus 10% value. So on what are they based? Once you've got that together, you can put your costing together. So now, these ad valorem costs do give a particular problem. Let me just illustrate that with this little exercise. When we train people, we give them this simple exercise to do because it illustrates a few points. So here in this little example, we have a full container load and we just put a round figure in there. We have an Ex Works value of 100,000 Rand. Those specific costs, road, rail, harbor costs, and what have you, for example, we say that came to 10,000 Rand. We only have one container, so that's 10,000 Rand. Now we have ad valorem costs of 5%. This 5% is based on the CIF value. Come back to that in a moment. Then we have sea freight. We've also called that 10,000 Rand per container. Then we have the marine insurance premium of 1%. Let's for now, we can't go into this in too much detail, so I'm just going to briefly illustrate this. Let's for now forget about that CIF plus 10% and just work on CIF. This would mean we've got 6% of our CIF value that we must take into account. Our problem is, and this problem every exporter faces, we do not yet know what our CIF value is. We cannot calculate our CIF value until we know what this is going to cost us, these ad valorem costs, and until we know what our insurance premium is going to cost us. We need those in order to come up with a CIF value, but we need a CIF value in order to come up with those. So it's the proverbial chicken and egg. The specific costs, as I said, before FOB, after FOB are no problem. It's these ad valorem costs that cause the problem. So, how do we go about this? This is the way exporters generally do it. They say, okay, I don't know what my CIF value is, but I do know that CIF is going to be my total invoice value. At the end of the day, that's what I'm going to invoice the buyer. So in other words, the CIF is going to be 100% of the value. So he says, right, my CIF is 100%. I am missing 6% of the CIF value, which means that the rest of these costs that I have, which here is 120,000, is equal to 94% of my CIF value. So if these costs are equal to 94% of my CIF value, I can take these costs and scale them up to 100%. So I've got 120,000, I'm just putting that into my calculator. I'm going to divide it by 96 and multiply 94 and multiply it by 100. 1.94 equal. That gives me a figure of 127,659 Rand. That is going to be my CIF value. So I've established the CIF value. Once I've got that value, I can work backwards and put in all those missing percentages. So I've briefly given you an outline of how we go about dealing with those. There are other implications, but in principle, that's the way the exporter goes about dealing with this. So then he can calculate. He can double back, put in all the missing costs, and then he adds these things up and just double checks that it comes back to the total that he originally estimated. I'm going to have to leave that at that because we don't have too much time. So the exporter has now calculated these costs. And by the way, he's calculated all of these in rands because that's what he's got. Even the freight, which is charged in US dollars, he converts it into rands and takes it into account. Once he's ended up with a total rand figure, he can now convert that into US dollars. I'm not sure if there are any questions you have based on what I've said there, or is that all clear?
Mike, no questions at this point.
Good. Okay, one last thing I just want to mention about freight. If you're shipping goods in a full container load, the freight rate is for the full container load. If you are shipping goods in a less than container load, the freight rate is per ton. Also a specific rate, so easy to deal with. It's a cost per ton. What is meant by a ton in sea freight language is it's a cost per ton or cubic meter, whichever is the greater. So you have to take into account both the weight and the volume. If you have something that weighs 1 ton, but that is 2 cubic meters, the shipping line is going to charge you for 2 tons, because to them, a ton is a cubic meter. If you are shipping the goods by air, all the same principles apply here. If you're shipping the goods by air, the airlines deal in kilograms. So they charge you on the kilogram basis, but they have also got a ratio. The airline ratio is, for every kilogram, you are allowed 6,000 cubic centimeters, not cubic meters, cubic centimeters. So you've got to calculate the total cubic centimeter, and a centimeter is about the size of a playing dice, okay? Calculate the total centimeters, divide it by 6,000 because you're allowed 6,000 per kilogram, and then see which is the greater, your actual weight or what they call the volumetric mass. And you will pay on whichever is the greater. Okay. Once you've done the costings, now you know what your basic prices, what your basic costs are. Pricing is a decision that you make with your cost in mind. So that is a marketing issue, not really a costing issue. But once you've done that, you're now in a position where you can actually formulate a quote. When it comes to quoting, I would just like to quote what the export director of a large international company said once. We were doing an in-house training course for them. And when we got to this point of quoting, he stood up and he said, before we start speaking about this, I just want to say that this is the most critical part of what we do. Because if we get it right, I'm quoting him more or less verbatim now. He says, if we get it right here, everything is plain sailing. If we get it wrong here, we create a rod for our own backs. And so how we put together a quote is very important. Remember, we said the quote must be comprehensive. It must cover everything. It must be unambiguous. Should not read more than one story into it. And it needs to be simple. And when you're quoting into a sophisticated market like the US, you need to get it right. If you don't get it right, it just creates a bad image for your company. So, a quote can take two formats, really. We can either do a quote, as in a quote on our company letterhead, or we can do a pro forma invoice, which also serves as a quote in international trade. So when do you do which? Well, that's up to you as an individual company. Some companies use quotes and pro forma invoices, others just use quotes. There is a circumstance, though, that does dictate when you can use a quote and when you can use a pro forma invoice. So all the information that is on a quote needs to be shown on a pro forma invoice, and vice versa. There is, however, one piece of information that must be on a pro forma invoice, but that need not be on a quote. And that is a deciding thing. If you don't have this one piece of information, you cannot use a pro forma invoice format. You must use a quote. And that simple piece of information is the quantity of the goods. Just like you cannot do a commercial invoice without specifying a quantity of goods, so you cannot do a pro forma invoice without specifying a quantity of goods. You can, however, do a quote without specifying a quantity of goods. So sometimes a buyer is inquiring of our product, and we may send him a quote without a specific quantity. In those cases, the seller gives a price per unit and invariably specifies a minimum order quantity. So that's not uncommon. A price per unit with a minimum order quantity. Then it's over to the buyer to, and for some companies, a minimum may be a full container load. It just depends on the company concerned. But other than that, the information must be the same. So I want to go through a checklist here, which outlines the minimum information that must be on the quote. Some of these items I'm going to spend less time on than others. The first three items I'm not going to spend any time on at all, because that's all quite obvious. Then when we come to the description of the product, obviously we got to, this gets back to what I've just spoken about. Is it a fixed quantity or a minimum quantity? If it's a fixed quantity, you can go the pro forma invoice route. If it's a minimum quantity, obviously not. You would also want to give the buyer some idea of the packing. If you're selling a product, for example, where there's 10 to a box, the buyer needs to know that, because he must order in your box sizes or whatever. So the seller must specify that. Obviously, he must give the price, and he needs to use the 3-letter international currency code. So USD for dollars and so forth. And when it comes to the amount, it's always advisable to give both a unit amount and a total amount. The next thing the seller needs to, The next thing the seller needs to do is address the question of fluctuations in currencies. If you give a US buyer a fixed US dollar rate, it means you are carrying the exchange risk. If the seller does not want to carry the exchange risk, he can specify that the exchange rate on the date of order applies. Normally, once the buyer places an order, then the exchange risk becomes the seller's. So if you just give a US dollar price and say nothing, then that becomes the firm US dollar price, and you carrying that fluctuation risk. Decision the seller must make. Then each price must be connected to an Incoterm. We spent a few minutes speaking about that already. So in our example, you need to give him an FOB price, unit and total. You need to give him a CFR price, unit and total, and a CIF price, unit and total. So it's not uncommon for the seller to give the buyer 3 prices and then leave it to the buyer to decide which term he wants to buy on. The next thing it says, you must add the geographic point at which the term applies. So just to say FOB and CIF isn't sufficient, it's FOB Durban, CIF New York, CFR New York. You must always add a geographic point. And then you need to add some clause somewhere on the quote that it's Incoterms 2020. Right, so we've given him the prices. The next thing we need to give him is some of the transport information. So the mode of transport. In the case of the US, it's either going to be air or sea. If it's air, most air freight is break bulk cargo. If it's sea, you need to tell him, is it port-to-port stuff or is it multimodal? The buyer needs to know that so that he can frame his order properly. The next thing is the cargo type. Is it containerized cargo? If it's containerized cargo, is it FCL, LCL, or groupage? FCL, full container load, means it's only one person's cargo in the container. LCL, as we've already spoken about, is a consolidated container, more than one person's cargo in it. Groupage and LCL are essentially the same thing. The difference being is that LCL service is provided by the shipping lines directly. Groupage is the same service provided by agents. So the buyer needs to know which of those are applicable. And then if it's not containerized cargo, By the way, if you say FCL, you need to tell him, is it multimodal or is it port to port? Otherwise, he doesn't know. If it's LCL, not so necessary to say multimodal because it's automatically multimodal. And groupage is also automatically multimodal, but there's no harm in saying it. And then is it break bulk? All your air freight is break bulk, or even bulk transport. That's your commodities that go on that basis. And then the routing. Is it a direct sailing? If it's port to port, it would be, for example, in the example I used, Durban, New York. If it is multimodal, it could be Durban, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Or even Johannesburg, Durban, New York. Or if the goods are being transshipped somewhere. Okay, Durban, New York, Houston. We need to give him the routing of the goods. Packing indications, we just said they're to the extent required. We're not going to go into that. Of all the points, the one I want to spend the most on is point number 10, because this even experienced sellers get wrong. Delivery. Every buyer wants to know how long it's going to take him to get the goods. So, for example, if I'm the seller and you the buyer in Pennsylvania, if I say delivery is 100 days, I'm just starting at the bottom here. Delivery is 100 days. What does that tell the buyer? It tells him absolutely nothing. So I've got to say the time at which the days begin counting. When do the 100 days start to count? Now, this depends on your payment method. We're going to speak about payment methods just now. But if your payment method is by a bank collection or open account, then the 100 days should start counting from the time you accept the buyer's order. That's the correct time. Not the date of the order, the date you accept the order. You can always backdate the order. We've had people doing that. If it's a letter of credit, again, it's not the date of the letter of credit. It's the date the seller accepts the letter of credit. Which means, of course, when you receive a letter of credit or when you receive an order, you need to email the buyer and accept the order. Or some companies call it confirmation of orders. Others send out what they call an acceptance of order. So that's when the days start counting. If, of course, if it's cash in advance, then it's receipt of a payment or deposit from that time. So we've covered two of the points. It's 100 days from acceptance of order. What does that tell the buyer? It still tells the buyer absolutely nothing, because it does not give the geographic point. I could have meant, well, the goods will leave my factory at 100 days from acceptance of order, and the buyer reads that as though the goods will be in his factory 100 days. So this causes friction and difficulties between buyers and sellers. So we have to specify a geographic point of delivery. So let us assume you've sold to the buyer, you've quoted him on a CIF New York basis, which means you're paying all the costs up to New York. You are insuring the goods up to New York. What is the correct geographic point of delivery? We say here, as dictated by the Incoterm. So, Let me give you a common clause that you see under this circumstance. The seller says on his quote or on his pro forma invoice, delivered New York, 100 days from acceptance of letter of credit. Well, at least we are being specific. Now the buyer knows exactly what the situation is, when he can expect those goods. But if we do that, yes, our quote is comprehensive, but it's not unambiguous. This is a common mistake exporters make when they quote. Why? For this simple reason. As we indicated earlier, FOB, CFR, CIF, and the same is true with FCA, CPT, and CIP. These are all departure terms, which means the seller's risk ends at the point of departure. Which means the seller is only responsible for making sure that the goods depart, and we can add there, in good order and on time. Not responsible for the due arrival of the goods. So if you quoted me CIF New York, and you gave me that delivery time, delivered New York 100 days from acceptance of LC, I will gladly accept it. But your quote has been ambiguous. I ask this simple question. If the ship were to sink, for example, would I have to pay you? Because you've been ambiguous, this becomes a very difficult question to answer. So, under departure terms, the seller restricts the point of delivery to the point of departure, not arrival. So even although you quoted me CIF New York, your delivery term should read like this. Delivered on board Durban, 100 days from acceptance of whatever. Delivered on board Durban. Why? Because FOB, CFR, and CIF all say this. It's a departure term. The seller's risks end once the goods depart, and that departure point is defined by the Incoterms as on board point of departure. So that's the correct term to use. We haven't even mentioned D terms here. If a seller were to be selling on D terms, those are arrival terms. Now he must quote an arrival time. A similar thing applies to FCA, CPT, and CIP. This is now multimodal, and it could apply to road, rail, air, or sea. It's a multimodal Incoterm. So you cannot say delivered on board any longer, because you're not delivering the goods on board a ship. So if one is using LCLs, multimodal FCLs, or air freight, should just modify that delivery clause a little bit and say delivered to carrier Johannesburg 100 days from whatever. So this is the one that often results in ambiguities on quotes. I've tried to make it clear how you avoid that ambiguity. The next thing we must speak about or cover on our quote is if you are selling on a CIF or CIP basis, then you must explain what the I is all about. And so you need to tell the buyer what the risks are covered. And these are institute cargo clauses A, B, C, war strikes, riots, civil commotion, even piracy, etc., etc. The most common for manufactured items is Institute Cargo Clause A. That is the most comprehensive. B and C are seldom used. They are used by people who sell commodities and the like. Your cargo, your manufactured goods is all Institute Cargo Clause A. In fact, just by the way, in 2020, they modified CIP. If you're selling on a CIP basis, the rules for Incoterms say it must be an A policy. CIF, they don't make that rule. It can be A, B, or C. Why? Because CIF is often still used for commodities, port-to-port stuff. So it could be A, B, or C. A, although it is the most comprehensive, does not cover wars, strikes, riots, civil commotions, even piracy. So it could be that an exporter says, or an importer wants, Clause A plus war, Clause A plus whatever. So it's possible to go beyond the A. So when you give me a CIF or CIP price, you need to make that clear. The insured value, you don't really need to say this because the Incoterms, both CIF and CIP, say the minimum insured value must be the full CIF or CIP value plus 10%. What the rules do say, however, is that the seller is only obliged to insure for the duration of the carriage. Now, this is a problem. If it's a port-to-port shipment, the duration of the carriage is port-to-port. If it's a multimodal warehouse to warehouse, then the duration of the carriage is warehouse to warehouse. But if it's a port-to-port shipment, most buyers are not happy with an insurance policy that covers port-to-port. It would mean that I'm sitting in Pittsburgh, the goods are insured up to New York, which means I must take out an additional policy now to cover the goods to Pittsburgh. So even if you are doing port-to-port shipments, most insurance policies are warehouse to warehouse. So you need to tell me that, because I don't know what you've done. Have you gone port to port, or are you giving me a warehouse to warehouse thing? So tell him that it's warehouse to warehouse. Can I add 2 things that it's a good idea to add to your quote? They are not listed here. Number 1, tell the buyer that there's no excesses on the policy, because Incoterms do not prohibit the use of excesses. There's no excesses, no deductibles, or anything untoward like that on the policy. When the buyer reads that, he feels assured, and he knows you know what you're talking about. So you tell him there's no excesses, and the other thing you tell him is that any claims are payable in his country. Because when you sell CIF or CIP, this certificate is going to go to the buyer. The buyer doesn't want to be in a position where he's got to claim against this policy and then discover he's got to come to South Africa to lodge a claim. So in addition to those things, you cover those 2 additional points. No franchises, deductibles, excesses, or anything like that, and claims are payable in the buyer's country. Right, then we must cover the payment methods. As we've already alluded to, there are 4 main payment methods used in international trade. Starting at the top, the most secure for the seller, cash in advance. You're not going to get that out of the US. Cash in advance, letters of credit, bank collections, and open account, or combinations thereof. So you need to cover that on the quote. And then connected to that are the credit terms, the number of days credit. And again, you've got to tell him when the days start counting. The 2 most common is from site. So you could say, I want a letter of credit at site. Site means immediate payment upon sight, not of the goods, but on sight of the documents, or from the date of the transport document. You'd normally say a letter of credit at 30 days from shipment date. Shipment could refer to air, road, rail, or whatever. Then the exporter needs to cover his standard conditions of sale. Now, most exporters do not list these conditions of sale on their quote. They say normally one of the two following things. Our standard conditions of sale are available on request, or they may be viewed on our website and give the URL. And then lastly, the validity date. Every quote should have a validity date. So this is the real skeleton of what should be on a quote. And the buyer needs to ensure that the seller needs to ensure that he covers all these things so that the buyer can place an order if he wants to. We've had a very short time to try and cover a lot of information, so I've squeezed it into there, and my time is now up.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. We've got a couple of questions for you here. The first is, and I think I know the answer to this, but if a client requests FOB quote in South African rands, must we add VAT?
The short answer is no. No.
Yeah.
The VAT regulations do allow FOB. We're speaking FOBC shipments.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, they do allow that to go VAT zero rated. The regulations do say the seller must charge VAT if he doesn't pay the freight. Now, FOB, you are not paying the freight. So technically you should charge VAT, but there's an allowance and exemption that if you can prove you've delivered the goods to a harbor or to an airport, so the same would apply if you're selling FCA Oliver Tambo, for example. If you can prove you've delivered the goods to a harbor or an airport, then you may zero rate.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Another question from Vero on ad valorem cost and insurance cost. The formula is clear, but she's wondering how accurate it is. And she's also saying isn't there a standard insurance cost for different goods or a range in that?
Okay. How accurate is the formula? I didn't go into that. In the example that I gave you, that formula would be 100% accurate. Okay. The problem arises when the ad valorem is based on different values. So some ad valorems may be based on the FOB value, and other ad valorem charges may be based on CIF value. Time didn't allow us to go into that, unfortunately. But then there are discrepancies, but there are ways of dealing with that. I don't know, if we had more time, we could discuss that. I could even give you some examples of that, but time doesn't allow us. But it's not a train smash. Even if you use the formula exactly as we've said in our little example there, it means generally you are overcosted a little bit because the one ad valorem is based on a slightly lower value, whereas the formula that I gave you works all on the higher value of CIF. Sorry, there was another part to that question.
The other part was, isn't there a standard insurance cost for different goods?
No, not really. Lots of factors influence that. The type of goods, yes. Even the company, because the big companies get better rates, and if you're shipping a lot, you get a better rate than smaller companies. So it's a pure commercial thing there.
Okay.
Can I just mention one other thing? I just used 1% there. That's not representative. I use that because that's an easier figure to illustrate with, okay? And insurance is, premium is generally lower than that, like 0.375% or something like that. And to get rid of that CIF plus 10%, all you do when you work that formula, you add the 10% to the premium, and then you base that on CIF. So if your premium was 1%, you would work on 1.1% of the CIF. It ends up at the same value. It gets rid of that problem of CIF plus 10%.
Awesome. Albertina is just asking you to just repeat the clause about where the seller risks end. If you just can you clarify that for her?
Oh, that is such an important point. All Incoterms that do not start with a D. So there are 3 Incoterms which begin with a D. Okay, they are DAP, DPU, and DDP. Those 3 terms are arrival terms, which means the seller carries the risk until the arrival of the goods. So the seller would insure those goods and keep the insurance certificate for himself. If that ship sinks, the buyer is not going to pay you. You would have to claim from the insurance. All other terms, E, F, and C terms, are departure terms, which means the seller is responsible up until the point of departure. So if you said FOB Durban, the point of departure is on board the ship in Durban. As soon as the goods go on board, seller's risk is over. Even if you said CIF New York in my example, the fact that you're paying the freight and the insurance to New York does not mean it is no longer a departure term. Seller's risk still ends at the point of departure, which is Durban. If you said FCA Oliver Tambo, CPT and CIP JFK, for example, seller's risk ends at the point of departure, which is Oliver Tambo. So you never quote an arrival time beyond that. And in those cases, the insurance certificate is sent to the buyer along with the other documents. Because if that aeroplane crashes or the goods are damaged, the buyer must claim from those insurance, and the buyer must pay the seller in full, because you can prove that the goods departed in good order and on time.
Great. And then just one final from Adriana. What term could you use if exporter delivers to the freight forwarder's premises in Johannesburg for delivery to client's premises? I guess that would depend on how your agreement with your buyer.
Client's premises in the US.
No, in Johannesburg. So if
you're delivering to Johannesburg to a freight forwarder for the clients, are the goods going to the US?
Yes, we'll assume.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll assume that. So we're assuming that the freight forwarder is providing a multimodal service. Then it would be FCA, his premises in Johannesburg. And if you want to go CPT and CIP, get the rates from the freight forwarder all the way to the destination and a CIP. Wherever you are not delivering the goods physically onto a ship yourself, it's FCA. It's not the FOB story.
Okay, then. Okay, brilliant. And then Mike, just one last one before you leave. A little bit of a plug for you guys, but if people want to get in touch with you, are they able to work with you directly to train their companies and their staff and their companies, or is this usually something that you do through associations?
No, Etrisa does it directly. Yeah.
All right. So if you're looking for more information and more wanting to get your teams trained up, Etrisa are a great company to work with. They can put together a bespoke package for you based on your current experience as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them. Great. Thanks very much for your time, Mike. Yeah, we'll share your contact details with people as well as we go.
Good. Thank you.
So up next, we have Graham. I'm going to just share a little slide on him. Go. So Graham Blackbeard from Southern Implant in South Africa is a top medical device manufacturer in South Africa. And he's going to give us some insight onto exporting medical devices into the US. And with loads of years of experience. Just to give you a little bit of insight into Graham, he has developed and manufactured heart valves, artificial hearts, and a variety of dental implant products. Temporomandibular joint prostheses and orthopedic arthroplasties. Tongue twisters for me here. Founded in 1987, Southern Implants is a South African manufacturer of dental implants and is a significant force in the international market by way of credible clinical data supporting an extensive and innovative product range. Approximately 80% of Southern Implants production is exported. Graham has given presentations at the Academy of Osseointegration and the World Congress of Oral Implantology, and has co-authored a number of international dental implant publications. So I'm going to stop sharing now and let Graham join us. Let's go here. Okay, great. Graham, please join us on screen.
Good. Am I there?
I don't see you. I don't know if it's on the wrong. Let's have a look at view here. There we go. I've got you. Awesome.
Good.
Great.
Excellent. Okay, good. Thank you very much, Rex and Mike. I've certainly learned a little bit from you over there. Fortunately, most of the products we make are very small. Everything goes by air freight. And from that point of view, it's really how quickly you can get things into different markets around the world. So we use all the various courier companies. We find that some are good in certain countries and some are bad in certain ways. And you also need to know which way they're going to take your goods, because if things go by Dubai, by air, they get lost at Dubai airport. You sometimes send 10 boxes and only 7 arrive and the other 3 go missing in Dubai. It seems to be one of the problem areas of the world at the moment. Otherwise ours is fairly simple in terms of all these various things. FCAs and all the rest we don't really have to worry about too much. So just a bit of background. Yeah, we've been making medical devices for a long time and we've been exporting to the USA for over 20 years. I'm a member of SAMED, which is the South African Medical Device Association, which is dominated probably by the importers, the multinationals. But MDMSA is another organization, which is the Medical Device Manufacturers of South Africa. And I think Simone is going to be speaking. She's our chairperson. And that is focused on local manufacture of medical devices. So people who export are generally members of the MDMSA, but some are members of both. I'm on the run one company totally, but I'm also on the board of some of the other companies in the group that we have. We export quite a bit to the USA. It's not our biggest market, believe it or not. We do export more to Europe and the UK and Australia, etc. However, the USA is the single biggest market for medical devices. And it's if you look at the consumption of medical devices in the USA, the value of that is worth more than all the consumption in China, Russia, India, Brazil. So it is an extremely important market, the USA, and therefore, yes, it's always on the top of everybody's list. The other thing with the USA is that you get fairly good prices for items, whereas in a place like Brazil and India, the prices are right down rock bottom. Cheap products tend to dominate those markets, whereas the USA go for quality, high volume, high value products. The other important thing is that the USA was the first country really to introduce proper regulation of medical devices. And believe it or not, it wasn't that long ago. It was in the 90s. So medical device regulation is new worldwide, if you start looking back 30 years or so. So the USA's system is fairly well developed. And in fact, it's an easier process than the new European medical device regulations, which were published in 2019, and they're coming into effect before March next year. So that is this, so the European one is now going to be MDD, and that is a very much more difficult medical device regulation than the USA's FDA. The result is that certain countries like Switzerland have opted out of the European medical device system, and Switzerland will accept FDA-approved products from America as opposed to the rest of Europe, which has sort of been lumped into this horrible MDD situation. So my point number 3 there is that it's easier regulatory to go the FDA route than it is at the moment to go the MDD route. And MDD for Europe is brand new, and as a result, there's still a lot of clarifications which are being done because people don't quite understand how to do it and what's really important and what isn't. The other nice thing about America is that the regulatory process is transparent and fair. There are lots of guidance documents and lots of ability to appeal, etc. So it's a very nice system to work with, and certainly a lot of companies are going to give up on Europe because of this MDD and rather concentrate on the FDA approval, which also gives you access to countries like Australia, Switzerland, Israel, South Africa. So it's a very good system relatively in terms of getting your products approved for sale. So getting your products approved by the FDA, first of all, you have to have your establishment in South Africa registered with the FDA. And the registration, I think, is about $7,000 a year, 120,000 Rand a year that you have. So it's an establishment registration so that they know where you are, where you're manufacturing, because they come in and audit you to check that you're doing things right. So that's the first thing, you've got to be registered. Next, you need an entity in the USA that will take some regulatory responsibility, that they discard of expired product and all that sort of stuff. Now, often you can get your distributor to do that, or you set up your own entity, or you can get a third-party company, Ermagro or whatever, that will take on that responsibility on your behalf. But you have to have, when you do your applications, you've got to say who the people are in the USA as well, not only the people here. Now, a few ways to get your product approved. They're depending on whether it qualifies for different things. And as I say, there are lots of guidance on this on the FDA's website. But the most common way is the 510K application, which is an application about equivalence, and probably over 90% of medical devices get approved on the 510 application basis. One of the nice things is that you hand in your application, and there's lots of guidance as to what has to be in that application. And once you put it in, it will take 90 days. Now, 90 days stops, or in that period, if they ask you for additional information, or to clarify something or go and test, then of course the clock stops. But if you've provided everything that you need, then your approval comes through in 3 months, in 90 days. And they're pretty good on this, whereas we find other parts of the world, they have these things like 90 days or whatever, and then of course their own inefficiency, and they just don't get back to you, and they don't keep to their own timelines. But the USA is great because they keep to it and they do it. And you can there's always a place to complain if you feel that you've been unfairly dealt with. So it's a very, very nice system for that. Should you use consultants for quality and regulatory affairs? And the answer is generally when you start out, absolutely, it's the way to do it. There are plenty of consultants in the USA and in South Africa that can set up and help you entrench your medical device quality management system, the most common being ISO 13485. But if you don't go for ISO 13485, you have to have an equivalent medical device quality management system. So a lot of people know about ISO 9001. This is the sort of medical version of ISO 9001. Of course, it's got a lot more to it. And to keep yourself ISO 13485, you've got to be audited on a regular basis to keep your certification. And you've got to get it done by a body that's obviously accepted by the USA. So there might be an SABS equivalent or whatever. You've just got to check whether that is going to be accepted by the USA, or whether you have to go to an organization like BSI or DECRA or whatever that has theirs accredited, so that it will be accepted by the USA. There are also many consultants that help you do the required testing and trials. So, for example, for heart valves, there are lists of things that you've got to do. You've got to put it in a cycling machine and have it go through the equivalent of so many beats that the patient's heart would do, etc. If it's a dental implant, as we do, it's got to go into a loading system for fatigue testing. And all of those things, they're pretty well controlled as to what you have to do. And you have to have it done by a certified laboratory that can do that. And that's one of the problems in this country, is that we often have test laboratories, and then if you really look into it, they're not perfectly certified. Some of their certifications have expired, etc. And you can't really go down these routes and then find that they're not right. So often you will have your testing of your products done outside of South Africa, knowing that that laboratory is certified to do this sort of testing. And that obviously adds cost as well. But yes, we always try to support the local testing laboratories, but do make sure that they make sure that all their equipment's properly calibrated and within the dates of the calibration, etc. Because those are the things that will be checked on, and you get caught out on that. Now, being in the market for such a long time, we don't use many consultants for these things, mainly because we've got our own regulatory department, so we can process our own items. We've bought all our own test machines, so that we don't have to rely on other people to do those things. So as you get more and more entrenched in a particular field, you end up becoming more and more self-contained within these type of things. But the consultants are always there to do that. Then the next thing you have to realize is that you're going to get audited. So this isn't a financial audit, it's a medical device audit. And if you're going to sell products in America, the FDA will send people to your plant in South Africa and audit you. And they will do that at least once every 5 years. And if they see that you bring in a lot of new products to market, they'll come more often. And if they see that there aren't complaints about your products, they probably might even come less often. So they do let you know that they've got somebody coming, and the person will generally come for a week, and they'll go through all your design files, and they'll do that. Other jurisdictions such as Europe send their auditors every year. So you end up, if you're in medical devices, being audited sort of all the time by different authorities. If you're still in Saudi Arabia, they have a Saudi Arabian FDA and they come and audit, etc. So you spend your life entertaining auditors in your facility. So there is a way out of that, and that is a thing called MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program. And this is a program whereby you get an auditor that's been trained by the FDA, the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians, etc. And they audit you on behalf of all the countries in which you sell your product. So it's a very big audit. Generally, it's a team of auditors that come, and they check that you're doing everything that's required in a multiple of countries. The only thing with MDSAP is it's pretty expensive. So each time they come and audit us, and then it limits you to just one audit a year, and you don't have to worry that other people are going to arrive, etc. So the MDSAP audit costs us between $500,000 and R1 million per year. And that's because these auditors have to come in, they fly business class, they stay in hotels, they're all from overseas, and an extremely expensive way to go. But certainly once you start exporting to multiple countries around the world, MDSAP is the better way to go. If you're only going to export to America, then you don't do that, and the FDA will send people here once in a while. So that's probably the easier way. So it really just depends on which countries you're going to be exporting to make your decision on that. The risks of selling in the USA is that you can get an import ban. So if their auditors come and audit you and they find something that they don't like, they will classify it as to, what sort of seriousness of risk this is. And if they feel it's a big risk, they just put an import ban on. And that means that your products can't get through US customs. So the customs officials are the barrier of getting your products into the USA. And with every shipment, you've got to put on there your 510K approval number of every product on the invoice, so that they can check that the product is properly approved, etc. They're the gatekeepers to stop the product coming in. And of course, if you have an import ban, customs gets told, and then your products cannot get into the USA. And to get out from an import ban generally takes about 2 or 3 years, by which time your whole business has collapsed. So a very, very important thing to not get an import ban. I've had one, and so we know how serious this is, and it was purely nothing to do with the safety of the product. It was to do with some documentation which the auditor didn't like, and a subsequent auditor said, gosh, he didn't realize that you could get an import ban for simply having some documentation that somebody doesn't like. So it is very dependent on the auditor as to whether he likes you or doesn't. And it's very serious if you do get an import ban. Fortunately, ours was about 15 years ago, so it was sort of a distant memory at the moment, but it's certainly something which they do on a regular basis. And obviously it damages your brand value and everything else that goes with it. Our biggest problem right at the moment is ever since South Africa was grey listed. And since that grey listing, what seems to happen is we used to be able to get product into America within a week, generally 4 days or so. Now, since the grey listing, everything seems to be blocked in customs. It just gets held there for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then it gets released. Probably they're doing extra checks that, that it's doesn't contain drugs or something. I have no idea what it is, but it's a major, major problem for us because we've had to increase our inventory holding in the USA because we can't get product there quicker than 2 to 4 weeks. And it's generally when you need something there urgently that it gets held up for the longest. So that's our biggest problem. And obviously, people sort of say, oh, well, the grey listing. My goodness, this is disastrous for our exporting, this grey listing thing. And we've really got to get out from that as soon as possible. Then just a little bit about costs of selling in the USA. You need a bigger margin. So in comparison to all the other countries that we sell in, the USA is extremely expensive. Sales reps to sell your product they'll cost you with their hotel accommodation and travel and various things that go with it, about $200,000 a year per person, which is much higher than anywhere else really in the world. And as a result, you have to allow the seller in the USA an extremely big margin to be able to work with, bigger than elsewhere. Another characteristic about medical devices in America is that most companies have KOLs, key opinion leaders, and certainly if you're going to have doctors that do anything for you, you have to have contracts, and they have to comply with the Sunshine Act, which is an act against bribery and corruption. So if you're going to pay a doctor to give a lecture somewhere, it's got to be in a contract, and it's got to be specified how much he's going to be paid, etc. They don't dictate how much you can or can't pay, but it certainly gets scrutinized and gets reported on, and it becomes public knowledge as to how much you pay any medical professional in the USA. So it's very open and transparent, although, the amounts are big. So you have to have a budget for key opinion leaders. Expos and brand building are also critically important in that market. It's a very competitive market. So you go to the shows or the conferences, they're generally worldwide, the International Association of Osseointegration, etc. And they're unbelievably expensive events to be at and to participate in. And obviously, if you have people on the podium, it's that much better. And generally, those are going to be your KOLs that you've got a contract with as well. So a lot of selling is done through educational events. So you run numerous courses. So that generally falls under marketing department, and extremely expensive to do. So the big thing that we found with the USA compared to anywhere else in the world is that, yes, you do get higher prices for your products, but you end up spending an enormous amount on maintaining that and keeping your whole system running. A final sort of aspect that I thought with is selling to the US government. We make a lot of products that are very much used in patients with cancers that have had resections of part of their maxilla or mandible. And it's something that we developed together with WITS, maxillofacial department, etc. And it's a niche area that we're very dominant. The same sort of thing for people who get shot and have parts of their facial anatomy destroyed. So we have a whole range of products for that. So the US military is a very good target for us to sell our products to. But at the moment we sell to them, but each and every case has to be motivated by the doctors involved. It's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of hassle, and eventually we get it in there. If we could get our products on the American ECAT system, which is the military buying system, it would become absolutely easy and we'd sell tons and tons more. But South Africa doesn't have a formal trade agreement with the USA. Now, AGOA isn't that sort of agreement. These sort of trade agreements are the trade agreements that America has with countries like Sweden. So if it's a Swedish product, you can get it on the ECAT system. If it's a South African product, you can't, because we don't have a proper trade agreement with the USA. So that is sort of something that's made me think, I'll have to start another branch of the company in Europe somewhere so that I can do this, or I've got to manufacture in the USA to be able to sell to the US military. And since we've got these unique products that are very much suited to the US military, and because they have enormous a number of employees, etc., that they treat really well, it's certainly one of our difficulties at the moment. Which also brings me to the last point there. Often you need to transfer personnel with particular skills from South Africa to your markets to support your product. And to get South Africans into the USA on a work visa is extremely difficult. And when we've dealt with immigration lawyers for this purpose, A, it costs a lot of money, and B, it takes a long time to get this to happen. But then they ask and they say, gosh, but if only your employee came from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you say, why? And they say, no, the DRC has a trade agreement with the USA, which allows for exchange of key personnel, but South Africa doesn't. South Africa evidently had one in preparation, but it was never signed off or completed. So a DRC company can transfer personnel to go and work in the USA very easily, but not South Africa. And that's a big problem, and it's a big cost factor, and it takes years and years. My managing director of our US company, which is based in Florida, it took nearly a year to transfer him from the UK. He'd run my office in the UK for 10 years, and to transfer him to America took more than a year. I think it took 18 months and enormous costs to do that. And then he moves his entire family, gets them all into schools, etc., and it's only temporary. And it's temporary for 3 years, and then you've got to reapply, and you've got to go out of the country. You have to go back to London to reapply. So it really does make things very difficult trying to be a South African company doing international trade. So one's just got to remember that. There are two routes into the US medical device market, the way that I see it. You can either do the long, hard way, which one of my companies has done, and that is that you build your own brand and you set up your own operation and you employ your own people, etc. But you have to be prepared to invest a lot of money to do that. And it will also take a lot longer than you think it will. And that is at least 200 million rand you need to be able to do that and to be able to start building your own brand value in the USA. A far easier way to do it is to go to a well-established US multinational company. So you go to the Medtronics or the J&Js of the world, etc., and you say to them, we will make you a product line that will fill a particular need. So you've got to discuss with them what are their needs, and then you do it so that you do the manufacture, you can do the regulatory, you can do all of that, but you then don't have this enormous expense to get brand awareness, etc. And you then team up with them as a manufacturer or a subcontractor. You'll label the product with their name. So we have a cardiac company here on my premises here, that does that. So we supply to St. Jude Medical in Minnesota. We develop the product for them. We manufacture it here, and we ship it all to Minnesota, and then they distribute it around the world through their well-established systems that they've already got going. So we don't do the marketing of it. And that's probably the shorter and easier route to get into the US market with medical devices, as opposed to trying to build your own brand, etc., which is almost a lifelong thing. It certainly doesn't happen in 3 years. Maybe you could do it in 5, but it would generally take between 10 and 20 years to build your own brand in the USA, because the market is very much determined by what other people use, etc. And it's very difficult, of course, to get entry into that market. So in summary, I don't think AGOA has very much to do with selling of medical devices in America, because I don't think medical devices generally get duties, etc., attached to them. We would like a proper trade agreement between South Africa and the USA so that we could sell to the US government, but I don't think that's going to happen in a great hurry, especially if we keep fraternizing with the Russians. We would like a proper customs and banking control system and putting the criminals in jail so that we can get off the grey list, so that we can get our products in without the hassles that we have. So that would be, I think, the wish list from MDMSA, certainly from my point of view. And now I'm ready to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Graham. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff you've got to say there. We don't seem to have any questions, but I think, you know, from our side, I think, yeah, from what we've seen, what you've been saying, it's quite a process to get your brand into the market. Have you guys ever been asked for private label kind of production or production on other people's specs?
Yes. So that's really what I'm alluding to, that is probably a quicker and easier way to go. So, for example, we manufacture a product for a Swiss company that does sell it in America. So in a particular sector of the market, zygomatic implants that go into your zygomas here, we manufacture all of those for the world's biggest dental implant company, which is based in Switzerland, and they sell in America, etc. So that is definitely the sort of easier way probably to do it, in that you immediately have access to markets through someone that's already proven.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I don't see any other questions. Next up, we have Simone. I'll just do a little outline of Simone's work. We work quite a lot with Simone as Catalyze. She sits on the board of MDMSA, who we help to take to various events around the world, and their members with us. So just to give you a little bit of outline on Simone, Simone is an industrial pharmacist with a production, R&D, and technical background. She has experience in regulatory affairs, quality management, laboratory management, validation, intellectual property, manufacturing, and productivity improvement. She is a member of MDMSA, SAFHE, SAPI, and sits on the SABS technical and SAPRA ITG committees. She is a SANUS technical expert for medical devices, as was extensively involved with SAMED on the regulatory, market access, and local manufacturing committees over the last 20 plus years. Simone also provides a medical textile market evaluation to expand textile medical devices for the SA Cotton Cluster, and participated in the MRC medical device landscape analysis. So thank you, Simone. Can you bring your camera on, and we'll let you take it from there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Carry on.
Can you see my screen?
I can. Do you want to make it full screen?
Yeah, I am. I wish I could do what Graham did and put my face onto the slide. I'll have to get some training from Graham. But yeah, Graham gave a really good overview and also quite a lot of detail as to what the regulatory platform is in regards to the US market. I'm going to take it slightly different in some of the other activities that are happening around health products. So yeah, preparing the African market for medical device products. I'm going to go a little bit into more about what's happening in regards to Africa. Just to introduce MDMSA, we, as Graham said, we were supported by SAMED for many years. We're now a focused and distinct voice and driver for local production initiatives, actions, and excellence. We are also, it's through member participation and membership of local manufacturing companies that is now obviously driving MDMSA. So yeah, we are looking to bring as many members on board, but not only local manufacturers, also those that are also involved in the supply chain, such as sterilizers, companies that do medical device designing, and also some component manufacturers as well. So yes, MDMSA is a non-for-profit company, and we also represent many manufacturers that operate through a diverse spectrum of medical devices. So if we look very briefly at who manufacturers are, they are manufacturing of goods using materials or components and through an assembly line. And this is where there's often a discussion as to, well, who is a local manufacturer? Because we do have a lot of assembly manufacturing happening, especially with things like procedure packs, but also people that bring in bulk and they then pack it under their own label. But there are three primary functions in any business or any company, and that could be production, operations, marketing, and finance. And the reason why I bring this up is that a lot of people forget that distribution is also part of the operations of a manufacturer. And this is where, in some cases, we can have quite a distinct relationship with a distributor that could even be navigating the export to America or even to Europe for our local manufacturing entity. So we've got to be cognizant that it may not be us ourselves doing the exports, it could be our distributors doing the exports on our behalf. Graham's already mentioned to you about the different aspects around the manufactured goods, the obligations, where the manufacturer has to have a quality management system. They need to follow the clause around design and development. And this is in the context of putting their technical evidence of safety and performance in a dossier or in a framework that somebody can do in the assessment, in which to then give you what we call product registration or a CE mark or product approval. We haven't started that approval in South Africa yet. So many of our manufacturers use the CE mark or the FDA approval in which to get their products to enable them to be exported. In the design and safety performance evidence, there's a lot to follow. We have what they call common specifications, which is like ISO 13485 or 14971 around risk assessment, and 10993 series around biocompatibility studies. So when you're manufacturing a product, it can be fairly expensive, not only to be able to get the certification to the quality management system, or the product assessment through the FDA, but there are costs involved in actually putting your product together for your safety and performance evidence, and sometimes those costs can be astronomical. So yes, the bottom line documentation that these assessors are looking for would be the technical file, and that is what navigates through to the label, instructions for use. And we have, in many cases, training requirements for our users. So with AGOA, I'm not going to go into slide in detail, but it does provide eligible sub-Saharan African countries some duty-free accesses. I'm not going. This is already mentioned in detail already. But what I want to paint the works of is around the Africans. We have got various African countries that, and the reason why I bring this up is that their go-to quality regulatory requirements often either FDA approval or a CE mark. So often our expense for FDA registration, we can amortize that expense through getting export opportunities into the rest of Africa. So this is something else that we as manufacturers are trying to enable to grow the local manufacturing sector within South Africa. We have what they call the African Medical Device Forum, which was the Pan-African Harmonization Working Body. And this is where the regulators through Africa are getting together to look at things like harmonization of standards and processes and using reliance and when they talk about reliance, it's about using this FDA and CE mark approvals to enable them to get into some of the African countries. We also have certain local standards authorities, like we have SABS South Africa, Botswana Bureau of Standards, and then they all sit on ARSO, which is the African Organization of Standards, to which I sit as well. So if you just look at what they're trying to do in the African region, I've mentioned already, is looking for a harmonized framework of regulations, establish the basis of reliance and recognition, which I've mentioned already. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that it would be wonderful to see that if we register our products with SAHPRA, that registration will enable us to go into the African countries as an African Union, similar to what they've done in Europe with the European Union. But this is going to need a lot of collaboration around the likes of the AMDF and AHWP, the IMDRF, and various other associations that navigate the regulatory space. So yes, the African Union tent, which I've mentioned already, which would be lovely to see, is an African registration of products that the FDA approval system gives us the reliance approval to go into Africa, especially for us manufacturers, to be able to have a better recovery of costs. Then we can rely on FDA registration with the increased sale volume demand from multiple African countries. Graham's already spoken about this. So FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, it's called the CDRH, is the regulator within Europe who is responsible for regulating firms for manufacturing, repacking, even relabeling and or importing the devices to be sold in the United States. So yes, their site is very informative, very user-friendly. They actually do answer their phones and they can be very helpful. But they also remember that the CDRH regulates radio emitting electronic products like we do in South Africa. We have a radiation control. So there may be additional regulatory footsteps that you need to follow to get your product approved in the United States. The USA, please be mindful that their product class differs to the European Union, UK, and South Africa, because they use class 1, 2, and 3. And in South Africa, we use class 1, 2A, 2B, 3 in the likes of A, B, C, and D. So in the pathway, Graham mentioned already about the different pathways with 510K, which is the pre-market notification, but there are other regulatory processes that may need to be followed. And I have got a picture coming up later on as well. But the basis for regulatory requirements for manufacturers, and this is really it's similar around most countries, and from what I see, is that you get an establishment registration, the medical device listing, in America, they use the 510K unless you're exempt, or you have to then, or you can need to follow the pre-market approval for your high-risk products. They also have investigational device exemption for clinical studies that you may need to follow. They have their own quality system regulation, the QSR. However, they are aligning very much to the 13485, which is becoming the international standard. Remember, there are different labeling requirements in many countries, including the African continent. So you may have to have additional or specific products with specific labeling. We're hoping that we're not going to have that for South Africa. And then there are specific medical device reporting structures in every country, which you need to be mindful of as well. So your establishment, I think I've got Rex's picture still on the screen. The establishment registration process follows the 21 CFR Part 807, if you need to look that up on the FDA site. So the regulatory roadmap, they talk about discovery and ideation, moving to invention and prototyping with preclinical work and clinical work. In devices, we have what they call usability studies and various other biocompatibility studies that you need to do. And then from that information through the technical evidence or the technical file, you get a regulatory decision before you can do product launch and then you've got post-market monitoring requirements in all your jurisdictions, including the FDA. But please remember, especially for medical devices, it's all very well getting the product registered in the country, but then you now need to navigate through possible health technology assessments before it will go into the hospital environments, and getting into a retail environment could be very different to going into the hospital environment. The FDA establishments, and I'm really mindful of time, are for both the domestic and foreign manufacturers, and your distributors need to register their establishments, mentioned already, and it's submitted electronically unless you get a waiver from the FDA. I'm sure, when we see where technology has gone now, that most regulators are going the electronic route. They say that all registration information must be verified annually between October the 1st and December the 31st of each year. In addition to registration, foreign manufacturers must also designate a US agent. And beginning of October 27, 2007, most establishments are required to pay an establishment fee. So here, if you want to navigate through, I got this off the Qualio site. I thought they gave a very nice picture on what the process is. So it's not the same process of registering your product. It all depends on what the class of the device is. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but you'll see that it tells you there that 510 is required for class 1, but it's not required for the other classifications, but they go through a different set of rules and requirements that you need to follow. So then, just getting close to the end, the supply chain is about procurement, manufacturing, warehousing, and transportation. And the reason why I bring this up is that in many cases, the warehousing and transportation may not necessarily be done by the manufacturer itself, but it can also be done by what we call subcontract arrangements through any company that does warehousing and transportation. We see this quite a bit in South Africa for imported goods, where they go through the DHL and the Bidvest warehousing groups. I can tell you and also transportation is quite important. And as we heard earlier on, it's about all the shipping arrangements that need to be considered. Please understand that there is a terminology around placing on the market. In South Africa, we can have numerous distributors bringing in the same product. Some, especially in different regions, you can have different distributors importing the very same product from overseas, and the same can be done possibly going into other markets as well. Yeah, just to end off, so what are our costs and time barriers to manufacturers? Obviously, registration. It's a big hurdle to get all the regulatory technical evidence, and it can be quite costly. So it's not only a time expense, it's also a monetary expense as well. I've already spoken about the labeling and instructions for use that also could come into play. Please bear in mind also that you've got certain advertising obligations that you might need to follow in those different markets. And your label instructions for use are generally the go-to place for your advertising claims. But please be aware that if you are going to advertise in other countries, you need to follow what their regulatory requirements are. And on top of that, countries, the regulators will all have their own adverse incident and post-market surveillance, as well as clinical evaluation requirements as well. And there you have it. Almost 2 minutes over time. I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I hope I've shared some interesting information with you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Simone. No questions on the chat at this stage. But yeah, just we've looked into, or you looked into and outlined exactly what people need to consider when getting their products into market. What I would like to ask you about is MDMSA. What have you guys got plans to look at possibly extend your membership into other Southern African countries and start giving access to those kind of people, those companies?
Quite interesting, and the answer is yes, that it is something that we are considering, and we're very mindful of and looking for other associations in the other countries. I think they have limited associations, and I've already had 1 or 2 that have asked if they could join us just to help them navigate the regulatory and technical space. So definitely yes, and as you know, we've got Africa Health coming up, and I'm expecting to have quite a lot of interaction in that regards.
All right, great. And then how can, in your personal capacity, how do you usually help people with their getting themselves ready for their products? Can you give us?
Okay, so for local manufacturers, both on the quality management side, but also on the technical side, I help people with their technical documentation, as well as navigating through some of the analytical testing and clinical requirements that they need. So yeah, quite broad spectrum. And I think it really comes from the production and technical experience that I've had over the past years. Not only mainly in wound dressings, but also other technologies. I mean, one comes to mind, it was the ventilator project, but I've also been fortunate to work with people working in the implant sector as well. And then obviously disinfectants and chemicals, wound dressings, and so forth.
And is that all very chemically based still, or is it starting to become something that you're using alternative products for in sort of wound care and various other things? Looking on the raw materials that you could get from Africa.
It's interesting because I do sit on a CSIR board. It's an advisory board, and there's some really interesting technologies coming through, especially with biomaterials. And you know, we used to have like porcine valves. Now we're looking at sort of plant-based absorptive wound dressings coming through. So there's some real new technologies coming through. and also you must remember, we've also got it on the sort of the computerization side as well, with wearable technology and software technologies coming through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Simone. See Diana saying it was a great session. Very, very nice to focus on medical devices. It's people look a lot at food and cosmetics and stuff coming out of Africa, but forget that we've got amazing technology and expertise coming out of Africa as well. And mustn't be overlooked. So at awesome prices as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for
thank you everyone else.
me.
Thank you very much, Graham, for joining us as well and giving us that great insight, and Mike as well. As mentioned, everyone else listening here, this is going to be available on YouTube and through our LinkedIn site, but we will be also editing this down so you can get a snapshot of what happened, so that you can actually find the information that you're looking for these sessions. But yeah, thank you very much for your time today, everyone, and wishing you a lovely Thursday afternoon, evening as well.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.